The coal scuttle slipped in his hand, and Alaric caught it before it hit the marble floor, but his heart did not stop pounding. Behind the study door, a voice he knew far too well was saying his real name. Not Tom, not Footman, Ashcombe. He had been inside Marlowe House for 3 weeks, wearing another man's coat and another man's manners, and in one careless breath, a stranger on the other side of a half-open door had almost undone everything. He pressed himself against the wall and listened. "The Ashcombe boy handled it well," said the voice. "Better than I expected." Alaric's jaw tightened. He did not move, he barely breathed. A second voice answered, quieter, older. "And the brother?" "Dealt with," said the first voice. "Cleanly. No one asks questions about a carriage that loses a wheel on a night road." The coal scuttle in Alaric's hand grew heavier than it should have been. His brother, Edmund, had died on a night road 6 months ago. A wheel had broken. Everyone said it was bad luck. Everyone said it was nothing more than poor weather and a poor road. Nobody had said murder. Alaric's hands were shaking now, though his face stayed still, because a footman who let his face show anything was a footman who got noticed, and Alaric could not afford to be noticed. Not here. Not yet. He forced his feet to move, one careful step after another, away from the study door, down the servants' corridor, until he reached the kitchen stairs and could finally let his breath out. 3 weeks ago, he had walked into Marlowe House as Tom Bellamy, a footman with steady hands and a quiet mouth, hired on the word of a steward who did not ask too many questions when paid enough coin. 3 weeks ago, all he had wanted was answers. A signature on a debt that made no sense. A brother who had never borrowed a shilling in his life, suddenly owing a fortune to a man he barely knew. Now he had an answer, and it terrified him more than any question ever had. Edmund had not lost control of a carriage. Edmund had been killed, and whoever had done it was standing in a study 20 feet away, discussing it the way another man might discuss the weather. Alaric reached the bottom of the stairs and nearly walked straight into Nora Fenwick, who was carrying a tray of polished silver, and looked at him the way she always did, like she could see straight through the footman's coat to whatever was underneath. "You look like you have seen a ghost," she said. "Something like that," Alaric answered, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. Nora set the tray down on the long kitchen table and studied him properly now, her dark eyes narrowing. She was the housekeeper's daughter, 17 years in this house, and she had a way of noticing things that other servants missed. She had noticed on his very first morning that his bow was wrong, too stiff, too proud. A real footman bent his back like it cost him nothing. Alaric's back had never learned to bend for anyone. Hopeless, she had called him that morning, and somehow the word had stuck to him like a burr, because nobody had spoken to him so plainly in years. Dukes were bowed to. Dukes were flattered. Dukes were never, ever called hopeless by a girl half his rank and twice his honesty. He had liked it far more than a duke should like anything a housekeeper's daughter said to him. "You are pale," Nora said now, reaching for his arm before she caught herself and pulled her hand back, remembering the rules of a house where a footman and a housekeeper's daughter did not touch, did not linger, did not do anything that might catch the wrong eye. "Tom, what happened?" Alaric wanted to tell her everything. The urge came up his throat like heat, and he had to swallow it back down, because the truth would put her in danger too, and he had already lost one person to whatever was happening inside these walls. "Nothing," he said. "I dropped a scuttle, frightened myself more than anything." Nora did not believe him. He could see it in the small tilt of her head, the way her mouth pressed thin. But she let it go, because a servant learned early which questions were safe to ask twice and which were not. "Lord Marlowe wants the fires built up in the east wing before supper," she said instead, turning back to her tray. "All of them. He has been odd about that wing all week." Alaric filed the words away carefully, the way he had learned to file away every strange detail of this house. The east wing. The locked door at the end of the east corridor that nobody discussed, that even the oldest maids crossed themselves near, as though it held something better left alone. "I will see to it," he said. He climbed the back stairs slowly, coal scuttle in hand, his mind running through everything he had just heard behind that study door. Marlowe had said the brother was dealt with cleanly, and that the Ashcombe boy had handled it well. Handled what well? What was there left to handle, if Edmund was already dead and Alaric himself was standing in this house wearing another man's name? Unless Marlowe already suspected there was an Ashcombe boy still walking around, still asking questions, still far too close for comfort. The thought settled in his stomach like a stone dropped into still water. He reached the east wing corridor and began building up the first grate, his hands moving through the motions his body had learned these past 3 weeks, even while his mind stayed 20 feet below in that study, turning over every word he had heard. Cleanly. No one asks questions. The real target was never the brother at all. He had not heard that last part yet. That would come later, in a conversation he was not meant to overhear either, but for now, kneeling before a cold grate in a corridor that smelled faintly of dust, and something else he could not name, Alaric Vane, 9th Duke of Ashcombe, understood only one thing with total clarity. He had come to this house, looking for the truth about his brother's death. He had found it. And now the men who had killed Edmund knew, in some fashion he did not yet understand, that an Ashcombe was still alive to ask questions about it. The fire caught slowly, orange light spreading across old stone, and Alaric watched it without seeing it, his mind already 3 moves ahead, already trying to work out how a footman with no name and no rank could survive long enough to bring down a man who owned half the county and answered to no one. He thought of Edmund's face, the way it had looked the last time they had spoken, laughing about something unimportant, some joke about a horse that would not behave. He thought of the funeral, the closed coffin, the whispers about weather and bad roads that everyone had accepted so easily because nobody wanted to imagine anything worse. He thought, too, though he tried not to, of Nora's hand pulling back before it touched his arm, and the careful worry in her voice when she asked him what happened. He had 3 choices now as he saw it. He could run, take what he knew to a magistrate who would likely laugh at a footman's claims against a lord, or worse, report the footman straight back to that same lord. He could stay silent, finish out his search for proof, and hope Marlowe's suspicion did not sharpen into certainty before he found it. Or he could do something reckless, something a duke might do and a footman never would, and confront the truth head-on before it came looking for him first. He chose, for now, to stay, to watch, to learn everything this house was hiding before it learned what he already knew. Down the corridor, a door he had not noticed before stood slightly open, and through the gap, Alaric caught the edge of a room he had never been permitted to enter. Old furniture, sheeted in white cloth, a writing desk, and on the desk, half hidden beneath a stack of papers, the unmistakable dark leather cover of a ledger. His pulse quickened. He glanced down the empty corridor, listened for footsteps, heard none. The fire behind him crackled, throwing long shadows across the stone floor, and somewhere below, faint and distant, he heard the low murmur of voices still speaking in that study, still discussing whatever fate they had planned for a man they believed already lay in a churchyard 6 months cold. They did not know he was standing 20 feet from proof of what they had done. They did not know he was close enough now to hear his own name spoken as a threat. Alaric closed the great door softly, rose to his feet, and walked toward that open door at the end of the corridor, toward the ledger and whatever secrets it held, his footsteps silent on the old stone floor, his heart beating with something that was no longer only fear. He reached the door and pushed it open a little further. The room smelled of old paper and dust, the kind of smell that came from a place shut away for months, maybe longer. Sheeted furniture stood like pale ghosts against the walls, and the writing desk sat in the middle of it all, as though someone had left it in a hurry and never come back to finish what they were doing. He crossed the room quickly and lifted the top papers away from the ledger beneath them. The leather cover was worn soft at the corners, the kind of wear that came from years of use, not months. He opened it to a page near the middle and ran his eyes down the columns of numbers and names, most of them meaning nothing to him yet, figures and dates in a careful, practiced hand. Then one name caught his eye, and his breath caught with it. Edmund Ashcombe. Beside the name was a sum of money larger than most men in the county would see in a lifetime, and a date, 3 days before the accident. Alaric's fingers tightened on the edge of the page. This was the debt, the forged debt that had appeared from nowhere, that had made no sense to anyone who knew his brother, that Alaric had crossed half the country and given up his own name to understand. Here it was, written down in a stranger's hand, in a locked room nobody was meant to enter. He wanted to tear the page free and carry it with him, proof at last, something solid to set against a Lord's word. But a torn page would be noticed within the hour, and a missing ledger sooner than that. He had learned enough in 3 weeks of silence to know that patience was worth more than triumph taken too soon. Instead, he memorized the page as best he could, the date, the sum, the small mark beside Edmund's name that looked almost like an initial but was too smudged to read clearly. He closed the ledger, set the papers back exactly as he had found them, and stepped toward the door. That was when he heard the footsteps on the stairs below, unhurried, heavy, the tread of a man who owned every stone in the house and never needed to hurry for anyone. Alaric slipped from the room, pulled the door nearly shut behind him, and returned to the fire he had already built, kneeling before it as though he had never left it at all. His hands found the poker and stirred the coals, steady, calm, the picture of a footman doing exactly what he was told to do and nothing more. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and paused. Alaric did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the fire, his shoulders bent in the practiced curve of a servant, and waited to see whether the footsteps would come closer, or whether, for now, he had not yet been found out. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous than a disguise. Behind him, unseen at first, a shadow shifted at the top of the main staircase, watching him go about his work with a stillness that suggested more than idle curiosity. The footsteps did not come closer. They turned, after a long moment, and faded back down the stairs, and Alaric let out a breath he had been holding so tightly his ribs ached with it. He did not move from the fire for a full minute, listening for any sign that the footsteps might return, but the corridor stayed quiet, save for the soft crackle of coal catching properly at last. When he finally rose, his knees felt stiff, and his mind felt crowded with everything he now knew and everything he still did not. He carried the empty coal bucket back down the servants' stairs, past the kitchen where a pot of something savory bubbled on the stove, past the still room where dried herbs hung in bundles from the ceiling, until he reached the small stone yard where the coal store sat against the outer wall. The evening air was cold and sharp, and he stood there a moment longer than he needed to, letting it clear his head. Edmund Ashcombe, a sum of money, a date 3 days before the accident. It was proof, or close enough to proof, that a magistrate willing to listen might see the shape of it. But proof of what exactly? A debt did not kill a man. Someone had to want Edmund dead badly enough to forge a fortune's worth of paper and then arrange for a wheel to fail on a dark road. Who wanted a second son of a minor title, dead badly enough to plan it so carefully. Unless, as the voice behind the study door had said, the real target was never the brother at all. Alaric turned the thought over as he refilled the bucket, working by feel more than sight in the fading light. If the target was not Edmund, then who? Their father had died 3 years past, leaving the title and the estate to Alaric, with Edmund holding nothing but a modest allowance and a courtesy title that meant little beyond polite conversation at dinner parties. There was no fortune in Edmund's name worth killing for. There was no title worth taking from him, because he had none to take. But there was one. Alaric straightened slowly, the bucket forgotten in his hand, as the shape of it came together in his mind like ice forming on a window pane, slow and then all at once. If someone wanted the Ashcombe title, truly wanted it, badly enough to plan a murder years in advance, they would not go after the Duke first. That would raise every question imaginable, bring every magistrate and every relative crawling out to demand answers. But a second son, quiet, unassuming, dead in an accident that could be explained away by weather and bad luck, that raised nothing. Nobody questioned an accident involving a man who held no real power. Unless the plan had always been to remove them both, one after the other, patient enough to wait for suspicion to fade before the second death arrived. The bucket felt suddenly very heavy in his hand. He was the second death. He had walked directly into the house of the man planning it, wearing a stranger's name, believing himself clever and unseen, when in truth he might have been walking toward exactly the trap that had already claimed his brother. He carried the coal back inside, forcing his face into calm, because a footman who looked as though he had just understood he was a marked man would draw eyes he could not afford to draw. In the kitchen, Nora was setting out plates for the servants' supper, her sleeves pushed up to her elbows, a smear of flour along her jaw that she had clearly not noticed. She glanced up as he entered and something in her expression shifted, softened, then sharpened again as she took in his face properly. "You still look unwell," she said, setting down the stack of plates. "Sit, eat something before you fall over." "I am fine," Alaric said, though his voice lacked conviction even to his own ears. "You are not," Nora said simply, and pulled out a chair for him with more force than the gesture strictly required. "Sit, Tom." He sat, because arguing with Nora Fenwick had proven, in 3 short weeks, to be a losing effort for anyone, Footman or Duke alike. She set a bowl in front of him, thick with barley and vegetables, and settled into the chair across from him with her own bowl, watching him with the same careful attention she gave to a stubborn stain on good linen. "You have been strange all evening," she said. "Strange even for you, and you are ordinarily quite strange." Despite everything pressing on his chest, Alaric felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. High praise. "I mean it," Nora said, and the humor dropped from her voice entirely. "Something happened today. I am not foolish enough to believe you dropped a scuttle over nothing, and I am not foolish enough to believe a grown man goes pale over spilled coal." Alaric studied her across the table, the flour still smudged on her jaw, her dark eyes steady and unflinching, and felt the old, familiar pull toward honesty that he had been fighting since his very first morning in this house. She had a way of making dishonesty feel not just difficult, but genuinely unkind, as though lying to her cost something he did not want to spend. "If I told you," he said carefully, "you would be in more danger than you already are, simply for having heard it." Nora set down her spoon. "That is not an answer that makes me feel better, Tom." "It is not meant to make you feel better," Alaric said. "It is meant to keep you safe." For a long moment, Nora said nothing, studying him with an expression he could not fully read, something between frustration and something gentler that he did not dare name, not here, not now, not with everything else crowding his mind. "You are not truly a footman," she said finally, quietly, not quite a question. Alaric's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. "I have watched you for 3 weeks," Nora continued, her voice low enough that it would not carry beyond their table. "You bow wrong. You speak wrong when you forget yourself. You read faster than any footman I have ever known, and I caught you last week reading a letter that was addressed to Lord Marlowe himself, upside down from across the room, faster than I could have read it right side up in close. Footmen do not do that, Tom, whoever you are. You are not who you say you are." Alaric set down his spoon slowly, his mind racing through every possible response, every lie he might offer that would satisfy her without endangering her further. But looking at her face, steady and searching and entirely unafraid, he found he did not have the will to lie again. "Not here," he said instead. "Not in this kitchen. If you truly want to know, meet me in the boot room after the house has gone quiet tonight." Nora's eyes narrowed, weighing the request, weighing him. Why should I trust a man who has lied to me for 3 weeks? "Because in 3 weeks," Alaric said, "I have never once lied about who I am to your face. I have simply never told you the truth of it. There is a difference, even if it does not feel like much of one." Something in her expression eased just slightly, and she gave a small nod. "The boot room, after the house is quiet, and Tom, or whoever you are, this had better be a very good explanation." "It will terrify you," he admitted. "I will not pretend otherwise." "I am not easily terrified," Nora said, though something flickered behind her eyes that suggested otherwise. Supper passed in an unsteady quiet after that, both of them aware of the conversation waiting for them later, both of them careful not to let anything show in front of the other servants filing in and out of the kitchen. Alaric ate without tasting much of anything, his mind circling the ledger, the study door, the shape of the plan he had begun to see, and the growing certainty that he had far less time than he had believed to find proof enough to bring Marlowe down before Marlowe finished what he had started. When the last of the supper dishes had been cleared and the younger servants had retreated to their rooms above the kitchen, Alaric made his way to the boot room at the back of the house, where boots and cloaks and umbrellas were kept in orderly rows, and where, at this hour, nobody had reason to come looking. Nora was already there when he arrived, a single candle burning low on the shelf beside her, her arms crossed over her chest in a posture that made it clear she expected an explanation and would not be leaving without one. "Well," she said, "who are you, Tom Bellamy, if that is even your name?" Alaric closed the door behind him gently, the candlelight throwing long shadows across the rows of boots, and took a breath that felt heavier than any he had taken in 3 weeks of careful pretending. "My name," he said, "is Alaric Vane. I am the 9th Duke of Ashcombe, and 6 months ago my brother was murdered in this house's affairs, though everyone believes it was an accident. I came here disguised as a footman to find out who did it and why. Today I overheard Lord Marlowe discussing it as though it were nothing more than a matter of business, and I found proof in a locked room upstairs that connects him directly to my brother's death." Nora's arms slowly uncrossed. The color left her face by degrees, not all at once, as the weight of what he had said settled over her. "A duke," she said faintly. "You have been carrying coal and polishing silver for 3 weeks, and you are a duke. I am aware of how it sounds." "And Lord Marlowe," Nora said, her voice dropping further still, "murdered your brother." "I believe so," Alaric said. "And I believe, though I cannot yet prove it, that his true aim was never Edmund at all. I believe the title was always the target, which means I may have walked directly into the plan meant to finish what began with my brother's death." Nora was quiet for a long moment, staring at him in the low candlelight as though seeing him properly for the first time, not Tom the footman with the stiff bow, but a man carrying grief and fear and purpose all at once, hidden beneath borrowed livery. "You are in danger," she said finally. "Real danger in this house. Tonight, tomorrow, every day you stay here." "Yes." "Then why?" Nora asked, her voice tightening with something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but close cousin to both. "Are you still here at all?" Alaric met her eyes steadily. "Because if I leave now, I lose whatever chance I have of proving what he did," and he continues on as though nothing happened, free to plan whatever comes next. "My brother deserves better than a closed coffin and a story about bad weather, and I would rather face danger with my eyes open than spend the rest of my life wondering what I might have found if I had only stayed a little longer." Nora studied him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression, resolve settling in where fear had been a moment before. "Then you will need someone in this house who knows it better than Marlowe does himself," she said. "Someone who has scrubbed every floor and dusted every shelf and knows precisely which servants can be trusted and which cannot. You are clever, Tom or Alaric, or whoever you wish to be tonight, but you are also hopeless, and you will get yourself caught within the week without help." Despite the fear sitting cold in his chest, Alaric felt something loosen there too, something almost like relief. "You would help me, knowing what it might cost you." "I have lived in this house my whole life," Nora said quietly. "I have watched Lord Marlowe rule over it like a small kingdom, and I have never once liked the way he looks at people he considers beneath him. If half of what you say is true, then he is far worse than unpleasant, and I would rather help bring that to light than spend one more year pretending I have not noticed." Outside the boot room, somewhere in the depths of the sleeping house, a door closed softly and both of them went still, listening. But no footsteps followed, no voice called out, and after a long moment, Nora let out a slow breath and reached for the candle. "We should not be seen together like this," she said. "Not now. Go back to your room and tomorrow act as though nothing has changed. I will find you when I have something useful to share." Alaric nodded, though something in him did not want to leave the small warmth of that boot room, the candlelight, the steady presence of someone who now knew the truth and had not run from it. But she was right, and caution had kept him alive this long. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not calling me a liar and walking away." Nora's mouth curved just slightly in the low light. "Ask me again once we have both survived this, Your Grace, and I will tell you whether thanks are truly in order." She slipped from the boot room first, and Alaric waited a careful count of 60 before following, his mind already turning toward tomorrow, toward the ledger upstairs and the study door where his brother's murder had been discussed like ordinary business, toward the dangerous, narrowing path he had chosen to walk. He did not yet know that Lord Marlowe's suspicion of his newest footman had already sharpened into something closer to certainty, or that a letter was already being drafted in that same study, a letter designed to test exactly how much the footman named Tom truly knew, and how far he might be willing to go to learn the rest. Morning came gray and damp, the kind of light that made the halls of Marlowe House feel colder than the season alone could explain. Alaric rose before dawn, as he had every day for 3 weeks, and moved through the motions of a footman's routine with a steadiness he did not entirely feel. Beneath the calm, his mind kept circling back to the boot room, to Nora's steady eyes in the candlelight, to the promise she had made without hesitation. He had expected fear from her. He had not expected resolve, and it left him both grateful and uneasy, because resolve in a house like this one carried its own dangers. He carried breakfast trays to the dining room, refilled the tea, and stood along the wall in the practiced stillness expected of him while Lord Marlowe ate in near silence, reading correspondence between bites. Alaric kept his eyes forward and his expression blank, though every instinct in him wanted to study the man's face for some sign of what he was planning next. Marlowe was younger than Alaric had expected when he first arrived, no more than 45, with the kind of handsome, weathered face that suggested years spent outdoors rather than behind a desk. He had inherited Marlowe House from an uncle rather than a father, a fact Alaric had learned early in his research, and the estate had come to him only after 2 cousins with stronger claims had died in quick succession, one from fever, one from a fall. At the time, nobody had thought to connect the deaths. Now, sitting in this dining room with his brother's murder confirmed in his ears, Alaric found himself wondering how many other convenient deaths trailed behind this particular inheritance. Marlowe set down his letter and looked up, his gaze passing over the room with the idle authority of a man who owned everything in it, servants included. His eyes settled on Alaric for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Tom," he said, "is that your name?" "Yes, my lord," Alaric answered, keeping his voice level and his eyes properly lowered. "You have been with us, 3 weeks now?" "Yes, my lord." Marlowe studied him a moment longer, and Alaric felt every muscle in his body go carefully still, the way a man might hold himself when a snake passed close by without yet deciding whether to strike. "You read well, I am told," Marlowe said, "for a footman." The The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, and Alaric understood, with sudden clarity, that someone had reported his careless moment with the letter last week. He kept his face composed with an effort that cost him more than he wanted to admit. "My mother taught me my letters, my lord," he said. "Before she passed, I have always been quick with reading, though I claim no great skill beyond that," Marlowe said, and returned his attention to his correspondence, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested the conversation had not truly ended, only paused. Alaric spent the rest of breakfast standing very still, his mind working through every possible way that single exchange might unfold. Marlowe suspected something. Perhaps not the full truth, not yet, but enough to keep a closer eye on the footman named Tom than he had before. Every day Alaric remained in this house now carried a sharper edge of risk, and he could not decide whether that made his search more urgent or simply more dangerous, or perhaps, he thought grimly, both at once. He found Nora in the linen room an hour later, folding sheets with quick, practiced hands, and though neither of them spoke of the night before, something had shifted between them, a shared weight now carried by two rather than one. "Marlowe spoke to me this morning," Alaric said quietly, keeping his voice low enough not to carry beyond the small room. "About my reading, someone told him." Nora's hands stilled over the linen. "Ellis," she said after a moment's thought. "The under footman. He has never liked you, Tom, and he curries favor with the housekeeper whenever he can manage it. It would not surprise me if he mentioned it simply to seem attentive. Whatever the reason, Marlowe is watching me now, more closely than before." "Then we have less time than we thought," Nora said, setting down the folded sheet and meeting his eyes with the same steady resolve from the night before. "I overheard something myself this morning, while bringing tea to the housekeeper's parlor. Marlowe's solicitor is drafting a letter. I did not hear all of it, but I heard enough to know it names someone as involved in a debt, someone who is not you and not your brother." Alaric's attention sharpened immediately. "Who?" "I do not know," Nora admitted. "The housekeeper came in before I could hear more, and I had to leave the room. But it troubled me, Tom. It sounded like they were building a story, the way a person builds a case they mean to use later, against someone who has not yet done anything wrong." Alaric turned this over carefully. A false conspirator, perhaps, someone Marlowe intended to blame if his scheme ever came under scrutiny, a name to offer up in place of his own if suspicion ever turned his direction. It would be a clever move, the kind of forward thinking that had likely kept Marlowe safe through two convenient cousin deaths and one murdered second son already. "We need to see that letter," Alaric said. "That is easier said than done," Nora replied. "The solicitor keeps his papers close, and Marlowe's study is rarely empty during the day." "Then we wait until it is empty," Alaric said. "Tonight, perhaps, or tomorrow. I have already been inside that upstairs room once. I can manage a study." Nora's expression tightened with worry, though she did not argue. "If you are caught in his study, Tom, there will be no explanation clever enough to save you. A locked room upstairs is one thing. His private study is another entirely." "I am aware of the risk," Alaric said, "but I would rather take it than wait for him to finish deciding what to do about me." They spent the remainder of the day in careful, separate silence, each attending to their duties as though nothing at all had changed, though Alaric felt the weight of Marlowe's earlier attention following him through every task, every corridor, every glance from the other servants who now seemed, in his heightened state of caution, to watch him more closely than they ever had before. He told himself it was only his own nerves working against him. He was not entirely convinced. That evening, after the household had settled and the last candles in the main hall had been extinguished, Alaric made his way carefully toward Marlowe's study, moving through corridors he now knew as well as any servant who had spent years within these walls. Nora had promised to keep watch near the main staircase, ready to cough loudly, a signal they had agreed upon, should anyone approach from that direction. The study door was unlocked, as he had hoped it might be, since Marlowe rarely expected anyone foolish enough to attempt what Alaric now intended. He slipped inside, closing the door soft behind him, and lit a single small candle he had carried from the kitchen, shielding its glow carefully with his hand as he crossed to the heavy oak desk that dominated the room. The desk was littered with papers, most of them dull correspondence concerning tenant rents and household accounts, but tucked beneath a stack near the corner, he found what he had been searching for. A letter, half finished, in a hand he recognized as the solicitor's careful script from the ledger upstairs. He read quickly, his heart hammering against his ribs as the words took shape before him. The letter named a groundskeeper, Walter Coombe, as the man responsible for tampering with the carriage wheel that had killed Edmund Ashcombe, painting him as a disgruntled servant with a grudge against the family, driven by some invented slight that the letter described in careful, damning detail. It was a fiction built to hold up under scrutiny, complete with dates and supposed motives, ready to be produced the moment anyone dared look too closely at the true story. Walter Coombe, the groundskeeper who had quit suddenly last spring, according to the whispers among the kitchen staff, though nobody had ever seen him leave, and nobody had heard from him since. Alaric's stomach turned as the full shape of it settled over him. Coombe had not quit. Coombe had likely met the same fate as Edmund, disposed of quietly and now conveniently available to bear the blame for a crime he had never committed, unable to argue otherwise because he was no longer alive to argue anything at all. He was so absorbed in the horror of it that he did not hear the footsteps in the corridor until they were nearly at the door, and by the time he realized his danger, it was already too late to reach the door himself. He blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness, and pressed himself into the shadow beside a tall bookshelf, just as the door opened and lamplight spilled across the floor. Marlowe stepped inside, alone, and Alaric held perfectly still, his heart pounding so loudly in his own ears that he feared it might somehow be audible across the room. Marlowe crossed to the desk, glanced over the papers scattered there, and paused, his hand hovering over the half-finished letter as though something about its position troubled him. For one long, unbearable moment, Alaric was certain he had been discovered, that Marlowe would look up and find him standing in the shadows, and that everything, the disguise, the search for truth, his very life would end in this room tonight. But Marlowe only frowned faintly, shifted the letter a fraction to one side, and turned toward the small side table where a decanter of brandy sat waiting. He poured himself a glass, drank it standing, and after a few long minutes that stretched like hours, gathered his letters, extinguished the lamp, and left the room, closing the door firmly behind him. Alaric remained frozen in the darkness for a full minute after the footsteps had faded, before finally allowing himself to breathe properly again. His legs felt unsteady as he crossed back to the door, and he had to pause, hand on the frame, to gather himself before slipping out into the corridor. Nora was waiting near the main staircase exactly where she had promised, her face pale with worry in the dim light. "I heard him," she whispered. "I could not warn you in time. He came from the east corridor, not the main stairs. I never expected it." "I am fine," Alaric said, though his voice shook slightly with the aftermath of fear. "I found the letter. They mean to blame a groundskeeper named Walter Coombe for the accident, a man who quit last spring." Nora's face went very still. "Walter Coombe did not quit," she said quietly. "I remember it clearly now. He was a kind man, older, always brought sweets for the kitchen girls at Christmas. One day he was simply gone, and Lord Marlowe told the housekeeper he had left suddenly for family reasons in the north. Nobody questioned it, because nobody ever questions Lord Marlowe." "I believe," Alaric said grimly, "that Walter Coombe is dead, killed the same way my brother was killed, and now being made to carry the blame for it, since a dead man cannot defend himself." Nora pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes bright with something between horror and fury. "Then we have to do something. We cannot simply let an innocent man's memory be used this way, on top of everything else he has already done. "We will," Alaric said, though even as he spoke the words, he felt the ground shifting beneath the plan they had barely begun to build. "But we need more than a letter half-finished in a locked study. We need something that will hold up before a magistrate, something that cannot simply be denied or destroyed before anyone with real authority sees it." They stood together in the dim corridor a moment longer, the weight of what they now knew pressing down between them, before Nora finally spoke again, her voice quieter now, more careful. "Tom," she said, still using the name out of old habit, though something in her tone suggested she was thinking of him differently now. "What happens when he realizes the letter has been touched? He will know someone was in that study." Alaric had already considered this, and the answer sat cold and uncomfortable in his chest. He may not notice immediately, but if he does, he will begin looking harder at anyone who might have reason to be curious about his private papers, which means, sooner rather than later, he may look harder at me. "Then perhaps," Nora said slowly, an idea clearly forming behind her eyes, "it is time we thought less about staying hidden, and more about how we bring this into the light before he can do anything about it." Alaric considered her words, the fear and the resolve both sitting plainly on her face in the low light, and felt something settle inside himself as well, a decision he had perhaps been circling for days without quite admitting it. "You may be right," he said quietly, "but we will need proof strong enough to matter, and a way to gather it that does not end with both of us disappearing the way Walter Coombe disappeared." "Then we had better start planning carefully," Nora said, "because I do not intend to let either of us become another convenient story Lord Marlowe tells to explain away his own crimes." They parted ways in the dark corridor, each retreating to their own quarters with minds too full for sleep, and neither of them noticed, in their careful attention to Marlowe's study and his suspicions, the quiet figure of Ellis the under-footman, watching from the shadow of the stairwell above, taking note of exactly where the footman named Tom had been standing, and exactly how long he had spent there in the dark. Ellis said nothing that night, and nothing the following morning either, but Alaric could feel the change in him at once, a certain smugness in the way the under-footman carried himself through breakfast service, as though he possessed a secret worth more than his usual wages. Alaric had learned, over 3 careful weeks, to read the small shifts in the households temper the way a sailor read weather, and this shift felt like a storm gathering just past the horizon, close enough to smell on the wind. By midday his fears were confirmed. A young maid, breathless and wide-eyed, found Alaric in the boot room where he was cleaning a pair of Marlowe's riding boots, and told him, in a rush of words, that Lord Marlowe had summoned Ellis to his study an hour ago, and the two had not yet come out. Alaric set down the boot brush carefully, his hands suddenly unsteady. If Ellis had seen him near the study last night, and had now taken that information directly to Marlowe, then whatever fragile safety his disguise had offered was likely already gone. He found Nora in the pantry, sorting jars of preserves, with a focus that did not match the tension visible in her shoulders. She looked up the moment he entered, and something passed between them without a single word spoken. "Ellis has been with Marlowe for over an hour," Alaric said quietly. Nora set down the jar in her hand. "Then we may not have the time we thought we had." "No," Alaric agreed, "we may not." They stood together in the small pantry, the shelves of preserved fruit and pickled vegetables an odd, mundane backdrop for the fear settling between them. And Alaric found himself thinking, with sudden and startling clarity, that whatever happened next, he did not regret the choice that had brought him here. He had come to this house a duke hiding behind a footman's coat, seeking answers about his brother's death, and along the way, without quite intending it, he had found someone who looked at him not as a title or an inheritance, but simply as a man worth trusting with the truth. "If he knows," Nora said slowly, "he will not simply dismiss you, Tom. A duke discovered spying in his house, having overheard a murder confessed aloud, is not a problem Lord Marlowe can solve with a dismissal letter. I know, Alaric said quietly. Then we cannot wait for him to act first, Nora said, her voice firming with resolve even as her face remained pale. We need to move today. Whatever proof we have, whatever we can gather in the hours we have left, we need to take it beyond these walls before he decides what to do about you. Alaric turned this over quickly, his mind working through every possibility, every risk, every remaining hour they might still have. The magistrate in the village. If we can reach him with what we know, the ledger, the forged debt, the letter about Walter Coombe, it may be enough to at least open an inquiry, even if it is not yet enough to convict. The magistrate is old and easily flattered by wealthy men, Nora said doubtfully. I have heard the housekeeper say as much more than once. He may not act quickly against a man like Lord Marlowe, whatever proof we bring him. Then we need more than the magistrate, Alaric said. We need witnesses, servants who have seen things, heard things the way you have, people who might speak if given the courage and the safety to do so. Nora considered this, her expression thoughtful despite the fear still visible beneath it. There is Agnes, the elder housemaid. She has been here longer than I have been alive, and she remembers the two cousins who died before Lord Marlowe inherited. She has never spoken of it plainly, but I have seen her cross herself when his name comes up, the way the maids do near that locked room upstairs. If anyone in this house knows more than they have said, it is Agnes. Then we start with her, Alaric said, quietly, carefully, before Ellis finishes whatever conversation he is having with Marlowe. They found Agnes in the linen room upstairs, her hands moving through a familiar, practiced rhythm of folding and stacking, and when Nora gently raised the subject of the two cousins who had died before Marlowe's inheritance, the older woman's hands stilled entirely, and her face, already lined with age, seemed to grow older still with the memory. I have wondered for years, Agnes said quietly, glancing toward the door as though even now the walls might be listening, whether those deaths were truly as simple as they seemed. The fever that took the elder cousin came on sudden, too sudden for a man who had been in good health only days before. And the fall that took the younger one happened at the very cliff path Lord Marlowe himself had walked with him that same afternoon, though he claimed he had left before the accident occurred. Alaric felt the pieces settling into place with a cold, terrible clarity. 3 deaths now, perhaps 4 if Walter Coombe was truly gone as well, all clearing a path toward the inheritance and the title that Marlowe now held, and his brother Edmund's death fitting the same pattern precisely. A life removed quietly enough that grief and bad luck absorbed the blame instead of suspicion. Would you speak of this, Alaric asked carefully, to a magistrate if it came to that? Agnes's face tightened with fear, old and deep-set. I have kept silent for years because I had no proof, only feelings I could not explain, and no one listens to an old housemaid's feelings against a lord's word. But if there is proof now, real proof, then yes. I have carried this too long already. It was not the full certainty Alaric had hoped for, but it was something, another voice willing to speak if the moment ever came. And he felt a small measure of the crushing weight on his chest ease, if only slightly. They left the linen room separately, careful as always not to be seen together too long or too often, and Alaric made his way back toward the main hall, his mind already working through the next steps, when he found Ellis waiting for him at the bottom of the servants' stairs, arms crossed, an expression of open satisfaction on his narrow face. Lord Marlowe wishes to see you, Ellis said, and there was no mistaking the pleasure in his voice. In his study, now. Alaric's stomach dropped, though he kept his face carefully composed, drawing on every ounce of the calm he had cultivated over 3 difficult weeks. Of course, he said simply, and walked past Ellis toward the study, his mind racing through every possible outcome of the conversation waiting for him, none of them good. The study door was open when he arrived, and Marlowe sat behind his desk, the half-finished letter about Walter Coombe nowhere in sight now, replaced by a single folded piece of paper that sat squarely in the center of the desk, as though placed there deliberately for Alaric to see. "Close the door," Marlowe said, without looking up. Alaric closed it, his heart hammering, and stood before the desk in the posture of a footman awaiting instruction, though every instinct in him screamed to run. "I understand," Marlowe said slowly, finally lifting his eyes, "that you were seen near my study rather late last night, standing quite still in the dark, according to my source, for rather a long time." "I was checking the fires had not gone out, my lord," Alaric said, keeping his voice steady with an effort that cost him dearly. "I did not wish to disturb you, so I waited in the shadow until you had finished with your brandy." Something flickered across Marlowe's face, and for a terrible, drawn-out moment, Alaric could not tell whether the man believed him or was simply enjoying the performance before revealing he already knew the truth. "How diligent of you," Marlowe said finally, his tone carrying a thin edge that suggested he had decided for now to play along with the lie. He picked up the folded paper from his desk and held it out. "I have a letter that needs delivering to a man in the village. It concerns a small matter of business, nothing that need concern you beyond the delivery itself. You will take it this afternoon, and you will wait for a reply." Alaric took the letter carefully, his fingers brushing the sealed edge, aware that this errand, however innocent it appeared, was almost certainly a test, a way to see whether the footman named Tom would behave exactly as expected, or whether something in his manner might slip and reveal more than Marlowe already suspected. "Of course, my lord," he said. "And Tom," Marlowe added, as Alaric turned to leave, his voice suddenly softer, almost pleasant, which somehow made the words that followed more chilling than any threat could have been. "I do hope you understand how very much I value loyalty in my household. Disloyalty, I find, tends to be dealt with rather more permanently than a simple dismissal." Alaric met his eyes for one careful moment, holding his expression as blank and unremarkable as 3 weeks of practice had taught him. "I understand completely, my lord." He left the study with the letter clutched in his hand, and his pulse hammering so loudly he was certain it must be visible in his throat, and made his way immediately to find Nora, who was waiting near the kitchen entrance with barely concealed worry written across her face. "He knows," Alaric said quietly, once they were far enough from other ears. "Or he suspects strongly enough that it hardly matters which. He gave me a letter to deliver in the village, and I believe it is a test, meant to see how I behave, or perhaps meant to lead me somewhere he can deal with me away from the house entirely." Nora's face went pale. "Then you cannot go alone." "I have little choice," Alaric said. "Refusing the errand would be its own confession. I must go, and I must be careful." "Then I am coming with you," Nora said, with a firmness that left no room for argument. "I can say I am visiting my aunt in the village, which is true enough, and I will stay close enough to help if something goes wrong." Alaric wanted to refuse, wanted to keep her as far from this danger as possible, but looking at the resolve in her face, he understood that arguing would waste time neither of them could afford, and that her presence, whatever the risk, might well be the difference between walking into a trap unprepared and walking into it with at least some chance of walking back out. "Very well," he said, "but you stay well back, and if anything happens, you run for the magistrate immediately, whatever becomes of me." "We will discuss that condition later," Nora said, in a tone that suggested she had no intention of honoring it, and turned to fetch her cloak, leaving Alaric standing in the kitchen with the sealed letter still warm from his own hand, and a growing, cold certainty that whatever waited for him in the village, it was not simple business at all. The road to the village ran along the edge of a wood, narrow and rutted from recent rain, and Alaric walked it with the sealed letter tucked inside his coat, his senses straining for anything out of the ordinary. Nora followed a short distance behind, close enough to help if needed, far enough to avoid drawing suspicion from anyone who might be watching. The village itself was small, a scattering of houses around a central square with a church at one end and a modest inn at the other. And Alaric found the address written on the letter without much difficulty. A narrow house near the edge of the square belonging to a man named Pratt, whom he recognized immediately as the solicitor whose careful hand had written both the ledger entries and the letter about Walter Coombe. He knocked, and a thin, nervous-looking man opened the door, glancing past Alaric's shoulder as though expecting someone else entirely. "You have a letter from Lord Marlowe," Pratt said, rather than asked, and held out his hand. Alaric passed it over, watching carefully as the solicitor broke the seal and read quickly, his expression shifting from wariness to something like relief, and then, troublingly, to a thin, satisfied smile. "You may tell his lordship," Pratt said, folding the letter away, "that everything proceeds according to plan. The papers regarding Coombe will be ready within the week, and the matter may be considered closed shortly after." Alaric kept his face carefully neutral, though the words landed like ice water down his spine. Whatever test this errand represented, it had also handed him exactly the confirmation he needed, spoken plainly from the solicitor's own mouth, that the plan to blame an innocent, likely murdered man for Edmund's death was moving forward with deliberate speed. "I will tell him," Alaric said simply, and turned to leave, forcing his steps to remain steady and unhurried even as every instinct screamed at him to run. He had gone perhaps 20 steps back toward the road when a voice called out behind him, not Pratt's, but another, rougher voice, and Alaric turned to find 2 men emerging from the narrow alley beside the solicitor's house. Men he did not recognize, built like laborers but moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with honest work. "Tom, is it?" one of them said, his tone carrying false pleasantness. "Lord Marlowe asked us to see you safely back to the house. Seems the roads have grown unsafe of late." Alaric's blood ran cold. There was no possible reason for Marlowe to send escorts for a simple footman's errand, unless the errand itself had never been about delivering a letter at all. "That is kind," Alaric said carefully, backing a step, his mind racing through the narrow options available to him. "But I am quite capable of finding my own way." "I am sure you are," the second man said, closing the distance between them with unhurried, deliberate steps. But his lordship was rather insistent. Alaric turned to run, but the first man was faster than his size suggested, closing the gap and seizing his arm with a grip like iron before he could take more than a few steps. Alaric twisted, struggling against the hold, his heart pounding with a fear sharper than anything he had felt inside the house itself, because here, on an open road with no witnesses beyond the shuttered windows of a quiet village, anything might happen and no one would ever know the truth of it. "Let him go." Nora's voice rang out sharp and clear across the square, and both men turned in surprise to find her standing several yards away, a heavy stone gripped in one hand and an expression of pure, unshaking fury on her face that seemed to catch even the 2 hardened men off guard. "This does not concern you, miss," the first man said, though his grip on Alaric's arm loosened slightly as his attention split between his captive and this unexpected interruption. "It concerns me a great deal," Nora said, taking a step closer, her voice carrying across the square loud enough that shutters began opening in the houses nearby, curious faces appearing at windows drawn by the commotion. "This man works in Lord Marlowe's household, same as I do, and I will not stand by while 2 strangers drag him off a public road in broad daylight. I have already sent word to the constable." This last part was a lie, spoken with such convincing steadiness that even Alaric, who knew it for a lie, nearly believed it himself, and the effect on the 2 men was immediate. They exchanged a wary glance, clearly unwilling to commit violence in front of a growing audience of village witnesses, whatever their original instructions might have been. "This is not finished," the second man muttered, releasing Alaric's arm with a shove that sent him stumbling backward, and the 2 of them retreated quickly down the alley they had emerged from, disappearing between the buildings as swiftly as they had appeared. Alaric caught his balance and turned to find Nora already crossing the square toward him, the stone still gripped tight in her hand, her face pale but fierce with the aftermath of what she had just done. "You were not meant to run for the magistrate," she said, breathless. "You were meant to run for me, apparently, since I seem to be doing all the rescuing today." Despite the fear still coursing through him, Alaric felt something close to laughter rise in his chest, sharp and startled and deeply grateful. "Remind me," he said, "never to underestimate you again." "You never should have in the first place," Nora said, though her voice trembled slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. "We need to leave. Now, before they decide the village is not witness enough to stop them trying again." They did not return to Marlowe House. Instead, guided by Nora's knowledge of the countryside, they made their way to the small cottage of the magistrate, an elderly man named Justice Hollies who lived a mile beyond the village proper. And though Nora had earlier doubted his willingness to act against a man of Marlowe's standing, necessity left them no better option remaining. Hollies listened to their account with a growing frown, his skepticism visible at first, the polite disbelief of a man accustomed to servants exaggerating grievances against their employers. But as Alaric revealed his true identity and described the ledger entry bearing his brother's name, the forged debt, the letter naming a dead groundskeeper as a scapegoat, and finally the two men who had attempted to seize him on the public road not an hour past, the magistrate's expression shifted from doubt to something considerably more grave. "You are certain of your identity," Holly said carefully. "The Duke of Ashcombe, working as a footman in Marlowe's household." "I can prove it easily enough, once we are away from immediate danger," Alaric said. "But I would ask you to consider, sir, why a common footman would invent such an elaborate and dangerous claim if it were not true." Holly studied him a long moment, then turned his attention to Nora. "And you, young woman, you are prepared to testify to what you have witnessed in that household?" "I am," Nora said, without hesitation. "As is Agnes, the elder housemaid, who remembers a great deal about the deaths of two cousins before Lord Marlowe's inheritance, deaths that never received the scrutiny they perhaps deserved." Hollies was quiet for a long moment, weighing what he had heard, and Alaric found himself holding his breath, aware that everything now rested on the willingness of one aging magistrate to act against a wealthy, powerful man on the strength of a footman's testimony and a housemaid's memory. "Very well," Holly said finally. "I will send word to the county sheriff and request that Marlowe House be searched on the grounds of the evidence you describe. It will take a day, perhaps two, to gather the men and the proper authority, but I believe, given what you have told me, that action is warranted." It was not the swift resolution Alaric had hoped for, but it was more than he had dared expect, and relief flooded through him even as new worry took its place. For a day or two was ample time for Marlowe, if he suspected his footman had already fled to the magistrate, to destroy the ledger, alter the letter, and dispose of whatever other evidence remained within his walls. "We cannot wait 2 days," Alaric said. "If Marlowe believes I have run, he will destroy everything before your men arrive." Hollies considered this, then nodded slowly. "Then perhaps," he said, "the appearance of your continued absence, combined with a swifter gathering of men than I first suggested, might serve us well. I know the sheriff personally. I believe I can convince him to move by morning rather than waiting the full 2 days." It was agreement enough, and Alaric and Nora spent that night in the safety of the magistrate's cottage, neither of them sleeping much despite the exhaustion pressing on them both, their minds too full of what tomorrow might bring. Morning arrived gray and cold, much like the morning 3 weeks past when Alaric had first walked into Marlowe House wearing a stranger's coat, and this time he returned not through the servants' entrance, but through the front door, walking beside the sheriff and 4 of his men, no longer hiding behind any name but his own. Lord Marlowe met them in the main hall, his composure cracking visibly the moment he recognized the man beside the sheriff as the footman he had known as Tom, now standing tall and unbowed in clothing that, though still simple, no longer carried the false humility of a servant's livery. "This is an outrage," Marlowe said, his voice sharp with fury barely restrained. "I do not know what lies this man has told you, but I assure you, Sheriff, there is no truth in any of it." "We shall see," the sheriff said calmly, and gave the order for his men to search the house, beginning with the locked room in the east wing. What followed was, for Alaric, both a vindication and a fresh wound reopened, as the ledger was recovered exactly where he had left it, the forged debt bearing Edmund's name laid bare before witnesses who could no longer dismiss it as servant's fancy. The letter naming Walter Combe as scapegoat was found as well, still sitting in Marlowe's study exactly as it had been. And Agnes, summoned from the kitchen, spoke at last of the two cousins and the suspicious circumstances of their deaths, her voice trembling but steady, years of silence finally broken. Marlowe's protests grew increasingly desperate as the evidence mounted, his composure crumbling further with each discovery, until finally, faced with the weight of ledger and letter and testimony together, he fell into a stony, furious silence that spoke louder than any denial could have. He was taken by the sheriff's men that same afternoon, his household staff gathered in the main hall to witness the end of the man, who had ruled over them for years with quiet, careful cruelty hidden behind polished manners and a handsome face. Among the servants who watched, several wept openly, others simply stood in stunned silence, and Alaric found himself standing near the great front doors, watching the carriage carry Marlowe away, feeling an exhaustion so complete it seemed to reach into his very bones. Edmund's name would be cleared now, the truth finally allowed to stand where a story about bad weather had stood before, and Walter Combe, whatever remained to be discovered of his fate, would not be remembered as a murderer, but as another victim of the same cruel ambition that had taken Edmund from the world too soon. It was Nora who found him there by the doors, still watching the empty drive where the carriage had disappeared, and she said nothing at first, simply standing beside him in the quiet aftermath of everything they had survived together. "You will be leaving now, I suppose," she said finally, her voice carefully light, though something beneath it suggested the question mattered more to her than she wished to admit. "Back to your own house, your own name, your own life." Alaric turned to look at her properly. This woman who had called him hopeless on his very first morning, and had never once treated him as anything more or less than exactly what he was, servant's coat or ducal title notwithstanding. "I will need to return to Ashcombe, yes," he said. "There is a great deal to set right, my brother's memory to properly honor, matters of the estate that have waited too long for my attention." "Of course," Nora said, and something in her face tried to close itself off, prepared for the polite distance that so often followed gratitude between people of very different stations. "But," Alaric continued, before she could turn away entirely, "I find myself reluctant to leave without first asking whether hopeless was ever truly about my beau, or whether it might have been about something else entirely, something I have been rather too slow to understand myself." Nora's eyes lifted to his, surprise and something warmer flickering there in equal measure. "That," she said slowly, "would depend rather a great deal on what you intend to do about it, Your Grace." Alaric found, for the first time in 3 long and frightening weeks, that he was smiling without any effort at all. "Then perhaps," he said, "you might allow me the chance to find out properly, once the last of this business is finally behind us." Outside, the gray morning was beginning to clear, sunlight breaking slowly through the clouds over Marlowe House, and for the first time since he had walked through its doors disguised as a stranger, Alaric felt something that had been missing through all of it, not merely relief, but the quiet, steady beginning of hope.